Welcome to Grafted In, the program that explores the Jewish roots of the Christian faith. Did you know that Jesus was Jewish? His Hebrew name is Yeshua. Did you know that the Virgin Mary was Jewish? Her name in Hebrew is Miriam. Did you know that all the early apostles were Jewish? Did you know the Apostle Paul said that Christians were grafted in to the Jewish roots? Each week, Pastor Don and Don Along will explore these and many more fascinating teachings about the Jewish roots of the Christian faith, as well as bringing you up to date on events happening in the land of Israel. This is a half hour you won't want to miss. And now, for today's teaching, let's join Pastor Don and Don Along.
Hello, this is Pastor Don Long once again with the Jewish roots of our Christian faith discussion as we look at Grafted In here today once again with my daughter Jordan as we talk about the richness that underlies our Christian faith when we fully embrace the Jewish roots under that faith. Jordan, we've been talking about the early Christians and how they went to the synagogue every week. That's where they went. We've been talking about the scriptures they used, which were all the Torah, the Tanakh. None of the New Testament had even been written at that point. We talked about the fact that Jesus was
Jewish,
and his name was
Yeshua.
His mother was
Miriam,
and she was
Jewish,
and his father was
Joseph,
and he was and the early disciples were all Jewish. And the great spokesman for the early Christian faith was who?
The Rabbi Shaul.
Rabbi Shaul. Oh, we know him as the Apostle Paul. That's his Greek name. But you see, it wasn't until around 300 AD when Constantine took over the church that it began to follow Gentile and Greek ways. And from there, the history just totally split it off from its Jewish roots. But now we're living in a day and age when all across the world, people are coming back to understand the Jewish roots of their Christian faith. You know, as late as the 4th and 5th century, Jordan, I have a note here that believers continued to attend the synagogue into the 4th and 5th century. So this idea, well, they always had a church separate from the synagogue, it's just not historically accurate. We've been lied to. In fact, John Chrysostom, who was a preacher at Antioch and Constantinople, complained in a series of sermons to his congregation. He said this, "You must stop going to the synagogue. You must not think that the synagogue is a holier place than our churches are." So they had started to build churches, but people still wanted to go to the synagogue. Why? Because they understood this is our roots. Dr. Chuck Pierce, in one of his books, says this, and I quote him. He says, "The early believers never imagined a Christianity that was not closely tied to the Jewish community." When those Jews received Yeshua as Messiah, they were not stopped being Jewish.
That's right.
How can you stop being a Jew when you're simply accepting your Jewish Messiah? I mean, that's strange, you know? We say to a Jew, "You received Jesus. Now you're no longer a Jew." Excuse me.
Quite the contrary.
Quite the contrary. You're a fulfilled Jew. You're a complete Jew. You've got your Jewish Messiah in your life. We, the Gentiles, who received Jesus, we've received a Jewish Messiah.
I think a lot of people will be quite shocked when they get up to heaven and see him.
Yes, he's going to be wearing a tallit.
He's not going to have blue eyes and blonde hair like they think. He's going to look very Middle Eastern.
In fact, they'll be shocked to find out that when he returns during the millennium, where's he coming back to?
Jerusalem. Not Boston.
Not Boston.
Not New York.
Not the Vatican.
Exactly.
He's coming back to rule and reign from Jerusalem in a restored Israel. And in fact, you know, the Bible tells us that in that millennium, that 1,000-year reign of peace when Yeshua comes back, the Bible tells us that believers from all the nations will be going to Jerusalem for the festival of tabernacles. Isn't that interesting? They won't be going there for Easter. Easter will not exist in the millennium. They will not be going there for Christmas. Christmas will not be celebrated during the millennium. They're going to be going to Jerusalem all across the world to celebrate tabernacles. And in fact, the prophets say that if any nation does not send a representative to tabernacles during this period, their nation will be under a curse. So here's another question that leads us to. Did the early believers stop the observance of the Jewish Sabbath and feasts? No, on the contrary. There's abundant evidence that the church celebrated Sabbath and the biblical feasts well into the 4th century. Let me quote some for you. Origen, 185 to 254 CE, quote, "After the festival of the Passover is put the festival of the Sabbath, and it is fitting for whoever is righteous among the saints to keep also the festival of the Sabbath." So he's talking about the celebration of Passover and the celebration of Sabbath. Another man by the name of Socrates Scholatis in the 4th century, how'd you like to have that name? He wrote, quote, "For almost all churches throughout the world celebrate the Lord's Supper on the Sabbath of the week. Yet the Christians of Alexandria and at Rome, on account of some ancient tradition, have ceased to do this." Wow. So he identifies in the 4th century that it began in Rome when they began to celebrate on Sunday rather than Sabbath. Sozomen, who was an early 5th century Catholic historian, he says this, quote, "The people of Constantinople and almost everywhere assemble together on the Sabbath as well as on the first day of the week." Now this is 5th century, and he's saying that in Constantinople, the Christians honored Sabbath, and then they also gathered on Sunday for a celebration as well. So when Constantine and the church began to distance itself from the Jewish roots, it took a long time to get Sabbath out of the church. But now Sabbath is coming back into the church. Amen. It's absolutely amazing that through the centuries there's always been Sabbath keepers. And so the question is, what about these feasts? What about tabernacles? What about Passover? And when we look at the feast, Jordan, we discover we're looking at a different calendar. What do you know about the Jewish calendar?
It's God's calendar. He said, like when they came out of Egypt, he said, "This will be the beginning of months to you," and that's April. April marks the beginning of the cycle of the feast.
Of the cycle of the feast, and that's God's calendar. And man has our own calendar. You know, we have a calendar we follow. Good to use if you're making appointments with people. And our calendar begins on January, and it runs all the way through December. Okay, and other people have, the Muslims have their own cycle of a calendar, but God has a calendar, and God says the first month is to be the beginning month. Is when they came out of Egypt. So what is the significant festival in that month?
Passover.
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 So through God's cycle, what we have is these moeds. What's a moed?
Moed is a divine appointment, a divinely appointed time when there's a more openness to meet with God.
A divine appointment. A moed is not just a date on a calendar. A moed is not just, oh yes, you know, it's Easter, it's Christmas. You know, by the way, those aren't moeds. But,
That's right.
But the moedim, that would be the plural of moed, is an appointment. It's an appointment. You know, if you have a doctor and you need to see him, he gives you what? An appointment. I will see you at 2 o'clock. Well, you don't show up at 10 o'clock. Or if you do, you're going to sit and wait because your appointment is at 2 o'clock. Okay?
You don't show up on a different day.
You don't show up on a different day and say, "Well, I thought I'd come Thursday. I don't know why he can't."
I wanted to come in and come to an appointment on that day.
That's right.
That's not when your appointment was.
That's right. That's right. I remember years ago being invited with a group of pastors down to Ronald Reagan's, when he was in the White House, to a briefing he was having for pastors around the United States. And we were told, you know, that he's going to meet us at such and such a time. Let's say it was 1 o'clock. 1 o'clock, we're to be seated in this little auditorium, about 300 of us, where he's going to come in and address us. And so to be there at 1 o'clock, we needed to be in our positions by 12 o'clock. And to be in our positions by 12, we needed to be at the White House at 11 o'clock to go through security. And part of security was we had to have our invitation, And then they would clear us, and then we'd go and we'd sit, and then he would come in at the what? Appointed time. And you could show up a day earlier and say, hey, I have a card that says I can see the president. They're going to look at your card and says, yeah, but the appointment is tomorrow. God has appointments, and they're his appointments called moeds. And all the festivals that are in God's calendar are not Jewish festivals.
That's right.
We call them that because primarily the Jewish people are the ones that celebrate them. But God says these are my appointed times. Look it up in the book of Leviticus chapter 23. These are my appointed times. And so God has appointed times when he can be. So here's the question. If God has appointed times, Sabbath is the appointed day of worship, the appointed holy day, Passover, Pentecost, Tabernacles, Yom Kippur, if these are God's appointed times, where did all these church days come from?
Man-made days.
Man-made days, exactly right, Jordan. So Easter and Christmas were not celebrated in the first few hundred years of the church. I know that's shocking to many of you, but the very early Christians didn't celebrate Easter, didn't celebrate Christmas. These were not days they celebrated, nor the Catholic saint feast days. These were not celebrated. Okay, they celebrated God's appointed times. Now, interestingly, when the kingdom of Israel, the two kingdoms split, you had the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And when there was that great division, that civil war after Solomon, and Jeroboam and Rehoboam were the two inheritors of the divided kingdom, the northern king was concerned that the Jewish people would keep going to Jerusalem, which was in the southern kingdom, to celebrate what? The Moedim, the festivals. So the Bible tells us that he appointed his own place and his own days. And the Bible calls them days after his own imagination. And
Yikes.
God holds against all the kings of the northern tribe that they were committing the sin of their first king in celebrating days of their own making. That phrase, days of their own making, is a phrase in the scripture of condemning man for replacing God's days with their own days.
Don't want to be caught doing that.
So, on the other hand, when we talk about Jewish roots, and Jewish roots fill us with meaning and purpose, so what do you find in the Moedim? What you've grown up with tabernacles and Passover as part of your Christian experience.
Well, I think that knowing Yeshua as Messiah enhances them. It brings out the trueness of it. I mean, Passover being when Yeshua, our Passover lamb, gave his life for us, it so much more enhances as you go through the Passover ceremony, the Seder meal. You see him written all over it. It's and with tabernacles and the joy of tabernacles and in dwelling in the sukkah and he came as the Word and dwelt among us. It's so rich, and each time we celebrate it, it only gets better.
Yeah, you mentioned several there, about Passover and about tabernacles, the joy of tabernacles. And we contrast that with historic Gentile Christianity celebrating Easter and Christmas as the two big Christian holidays. And it's very interesting because in the Jewish roots movement, as people have gotten into God's festivals, the festivals inherently speak of God and his plan of redemption. And the 7 festivals through the year portray the event of how God redeems us. And tabernacles, where the Jewish people, where we dwell in booths and temporary dwellings. Interestingly, one of the paraphrases of John chapter 1 says, and he came and tabernacled among us. Most Bibles say he dwelt among us, but the word is tabernacled among us. I mean, these very moeds, the very holidays themselves, festivals become filled with rich meaning. But look what's happened to Christmas over the years. I mean, the average person in America right now detached Jesus entirely from Christmas.
It's the greatest time of depression.
Yeah, and giving of gifts and singing of Christmas carols and Santa Claus and all kinds of different things. And Easter, we know, is just filled with all kinds of pagan things that have come in. But the moeds still remain pure. Isn't that interesting? God's appointed feasts still speak of God's redemption, but man's made up Easter and Christmas have become thoroughly contaminated with worldly pagan ways. Could it be that if we get down to our Jewish roots, we're going to rediscover the richness in Christianity? Well, we trust you've enjoyed our discussion today. This is Pastor Don Long and Jordan. We will see you next week on Grafted In.